The girl's body was found in the chair where she had lived for the last 10 years. Blood and traces of the girl's menstrual blood, dripping from the hand of the man who shot himself nearby, were on the floor. The room looked as if time had stood still. Investigators would later say, in this house, love and violence became one and the same. The Langston family lived on the outskirts of Charleston, South Carolina, in a small one-story house surrounded by an old fence. Neighbors rarely saw them together, but they knew, after an accident, their 15-year-old daughter Sarah was permanently confined to a wheelchair. Their mother left shortly afterward, unable to cope with the changes in the home, leaving her husband and child to cope with the aftermath of the tragedy. John Langston, an employee at the local lumber mill, assumed the role of sole caregiver. He barely interacted with his neighbors, didn't invite guests, and stopped showing up at the local bar where he used to while away his evenings. He often missed work shifts, citing concern for his daughter. No one questioned him. The neighborhood was used to keeping a low profile. Sarah was a withdrawn but polite girl. After being discharged from the hospital, she was homeschooled. A teacher came once a week and noted the oppressive silence that always reigned in the house. The windows were curtained. The smell of hand sanitizer lingered constantly, and John never left his daughter's side. He cooked, fed her, massaged her, and monitored her medication intake. He seemed like a model father, dedicating his life to caring for his child. But gradually, everyday details turned into alarming details. The postman recalled that John always answered the door himself, even if the letter was addressed to his daughter. A nurse at the clinic noted that he wouldn't allow anyone to speak to Sarah without him. When a rehabilitation center offered a recovery program, he declined, citing her psychological vulnerability. Medical records include complaints of insomnia, mood swings, and anxiety attacks. Sarah's doctor recommended a psychiatrist, but John didn't answer the call. Sarah hasn't returned the call since. Neighbors began noticing lights constantly burning in the windows of the house. Sometimes at night, muffled sounds could be heard, something like shouting or arguing. No one called the police. The neighborhood was rough, and they'd gotten used to the noise. However, in the summer of 2008, according to a neighbor across the street, Sarah stopped even going out onto the porch. Previously, she'd at least occasionally sat by the window, watching the street, but now the curtains were always closed. When social services attempted to conduct a routine inspection, no one answered the door. A week later, John himself called the department and reported that his daughter was feeling unwell and that they needed some peace. The inspection was postponed, and a month later, the case was closed due to lack of evidence of a threat. At that time, the family almost disappeared from view. John completely stopped showing up at work, declaring he was taking unpaid leave. They only had enough money for groceries and medicine. He sold his car and stopped paying for TV and internet. Their phone was disconnected. Investigators would later determine that it was during this period that the Langstons' lives became a vicious cycle. Sleep, care, feeding, silence. The house became a place where time stood still. There was no music, no guests, and even the birds avoided landing on the old roof. Several neighbors did notice changes in John's behavior. He became irritable, rude, and sometimes talked to himself while standing by the fence. One resident recalled hearing John yell at someone inside the house and then standing on the porch for a long time with a blank stare. These episodes became more and more frequent. In the fall of 2009, Sarah stopped receiving packages from the medical center. Letters addressed to her arrived, but they were all returned marked addressee missing. The house essentially became an isolated space, governed only by John Langston's internal rules. When tragedy struck 2 years later, neighbors admitted no one was surprised, not because they expected murder, but because the house had long ceased to be part of their street. It stood as a silent reminder that anything could happen inside, and no one would ever know. After his mother's departure, the relationship between John and Sarah became withdrawn and anxious. He devoted himself entirely to caring for her, allowing no one outside to intervene. Everything that happened inside the house became uncontrollable. The nurses who occasionally came to check on her could no longer speak to her. Her father wouldn't allow it. "She's getting tired," he'd say, closing the door. Over the years, his care became total. He woke up before her, prepared her bath, fed her, dressed her, and spent hours brushing her hair. Any outside interference seemed threatening to him. He said no one would understand how much she needed care. Gradually, care turned into dependence, and dependence into isolation. Sarah stopped seeing her friends and stopped communicating online, although she had previously corresponded with other people with disabilities. Her father attributed this to her insecurity, and vulnerability. In reality, he blocked all communication. He controlled what books she read, what movies she watched, even what time she went to bed. Neighbors recalled that the house often had lights on at night. Quiet conversations could sometimes be heard through closed windows. Sarah's voice was weak, almost inaudible. John's was insistent, commanding. He didn't talk, he persuaded, one investigator would later say. When social services attempted to contact the family again, John explained that his daughter had become overly nervous and visits were contraindicated. He sent letters signed by a doctor who, as it later turned out, had not worked at the clinic for a long time. No investigation was conducted. From then on, their life completely lost its external bearings. Sarah no longer knew what day it was and didn't go outside. He explained it out of concern. "It's cold out there, there's a draft." She believed him. Over time, the words doctors, people, and street began to sound distant and dangerous to her. John stopped working. He sold things from the house, the television, his tools, even his wife's ring. The money went toward medication, but the medications were becoming redundant. Sarah increasingly asked for the opportunity to communicate with someone outside the home, at least a psychologist. He replied, "I am your world." Investigators would later determine that around this time, John began to behave unpredictably. He would sit by her bed for long periods, stroking her hair and telling her how difficult it was for him to be alone. His speech became emotional and plaintive. Sarah, according to experts, was unable to resist. Physically dependent, she became emotionally submissive. Gradually, the distance between care and control disappeared. When she cried, he considered it ingratitude. When she smiled, he said she was doing it for someone else. Everything that concerned her body became the subject of his decisions. He knew how to feed her, how to lift her, how to touch her, and he used this knowledge. Neighbors described strange changes in John's behavior. He began closing the windows more tightly and cordoned off the house with thick plastic so no one could see what was going on inside. Sometimes at night, they would hear him talking to her in a raised voice, followed by long periods of silence. Sarah's diary, later found, contained the following entry. "He says I'm his only reason to live. If I leave, he'll die. I don't know which of us is weaker." This phrase became a key piece of evidence in understanding how deep the addiction had gone. The isolation continued for years. Sarah no longer knew where her will ended, and his power began. To the outside world, it looked like the sacrifice of a father who had dedicated his life to caring for his sick daughter. But behind closed doors, the opposite gradually occurred. A disappearance of the individual, where care became a form of control, and control became a substitute for love. In the spring of 2010, Sarah stopped writing in her diary. Her last entry was brief. "He said I shouldn't be afraid of being needed anymore." 6 months later, the neighbors stopped even hearing her voices. Since early 2011, John Langston's behavior had become not only controlling, but also obsessive. He no longer differentiated between caring and his own needs. His touches ceased to be medical or domestic. They became a way to fill the void he lived in. Every morning, he would come to her bedside, checking her breathing, her sleep, and her response to his voice. Sarah tried not to look him in the eye, because any expression that didn't match his expectations irritated her. He began spending more and more time with her in the confined space of the bedroom, devoid of clocks and mirrors. The house was silent, only the sounds of breathing and the mechanical hum of the stroller. John explained that her body needed constant care. He changed her clothes himself, barring outsiders, and refused offers of nurses and assistants. He considered any touch from another person to be an intrusion. According to investigators, it was during this period that a psychological bond developed between them, in which care turned into dependence and dependence into repression. John increasingly said that Sarah was the only one worth living for. His notebooks, found after the tragedy, contained phrases like, "She belongs only to me," and "everything else is a threat." The medical professionals he occasionally consulted for prescriptions noticed increased anxiety in his behavior. He began avoiding direct questions and became irritated at the mention of psychologists. Doctors advised him to seek help for himself, but he replied that he couldn't leave it for a minute. Sarah was gradually losing the ability to distinguish between concern and intrusion. When he stroked her hair or held her hand for too long, she didn't know what to say. He would whisper about how they were both worthless, how the world wouldn't understand them, how they were destined to be alone. At first, it sounded like a declaration of love from a father to his daughter, but over time, These words began to sound like an excuse for what was happening between them. One day she tried to object, saying she wanted to return to her rehabilitation sessions. John reacted violently. He shouted that she was ungrateful and wanted to go off with strangers. For several days after that, the lights in the house wouldn't turn on, and Sarah would remain alone in the dark, listening to his footsteps through the wall. This incident was a turning point. After that, she never argued again. Neighbors recalled that John seemed tired, but strangely calm that year. He shaved less often, wore the same clothes, and his eyes were red and dull. Sometimes he'd sit on the porch, looking out at the empty street as if deciding something. No one suspected that something was unfolding in the house next door that could no longer be stopped. In the spring, Sarah began losing weight rapidly. Her father's psychological pressure was taking its toll on her. She barely ate without his permission, fell asleep in his presence, and woke up if he left. Her body weakened, and her willpower vanished. He, on the other hand, grew increasingly confident, as if each day he became more convinced he was doing everything right. In June 2011, social services tried to contact them again. An inspector stood at the door, but John wouldn't let them in. He said his daughter was resting and didn't want to see anyone. Investigators would later find a report marked "Contact Impossible." This was the last official visit. By this time, the house had become like a capsule, a closed system where only two people existed. He told her the world outside was evil, that her body was her prison, but he was the only one who could make that prison softer. He held her hand, whispering that she should be grateful she wasn't alone. Sometimes he cried, begging her not to leave him. These moments frightened her more than his screams. Sarah's notebook, found under her pillow, contained a short note. "He started looking at me differently, not like a daughter, like I owed him something back." After that date, there were blank pages. No one from outside intervened. The house, once filled with the sounds of television and quiet conversations, became a place where one person's breath determined another's life. When everything reached the point of no return, there was no longer any fear or resistance between them, only dependence, pushed to the limit. On the night of October 18, 2011, the temperature in the Langston house was above normal. The windows remained closed and the bedroom was stuffy. John was awake. He sat by his daughter's bed, watching her breathe. His hand rested constantly on the armrest of her stroller. Sarah no longer questioned why he was so close. She knew any word could cause a flare of irritation. A few weeks before, he had become especially nervous. Neighbors said they heard him throwing things against the wall at night and talking loudly to himself. There was no alcohol in the house, but his behavior resembled that of a man living in a constant internal turmoil. His thoughts became obsessive. He wrote notes repeating the same things over and over again. "We should be together. She has no right to leave. It's all over without her." Sarah barely spoke. She spent her days in silence, listening to him walk around the house, opening and closing doors. Sometimes he would place a mirror in front of her and ask her to look at herself. "You're beautiful. People won't understand, but I do," he would say, gently touching her shoulder. She looked away, trying not to breathe loudly. Gradually, he stopped leaving the room. His presence became constant. He ate there, slept there, spent hours sitting next to her. He considered it caring, but for her, it was a trap. Any attempt to ask for privacy ended in outbursts of rage. He said she was ashamed of him, that her instilled shame was the result of the outside world. He demanded that she trust him completely. The pressure intensified daily. He forbade her to sleep until he himself fell asleep. He checked her breathing at night, touched her face, as if seeking confirmation of his need. When she tried to turn away, he grew cold and said, "You're forgetting who's keeping you alive." These words became more and more frequent. The psychological stress became a threat. According to experts who analyzed the correspondence and recordings, his behavior combined signs of depression and possessive delusions. He believed that society had condemned them to suffering and that their relationship was the only meaningful one. In mid-October, Sarah wrote her final note. "He's not the same anymore. I'm afraid of his hands." This phrase was dated the day before the tragedy. Late that evening, John went out onto the porch several times, then returned. Seemingly hesitant, he said out loud that he wouldn't let them take her. No one knew who he meant. Experts concluded that his state during those hours was on the verge of a psychotic break. Around 3 in the morning, he approached her bed. She wasn't asleep. She was simply lying there with her eyes closed, pretending to be asleep. He sat down next to her, was silent for a long moment, then said quietly, "You know I can't live without you." Sarah didn't respond. Then he leaned closer, hugged her, and whispered, "No one will separate us." The next morning, when the police forced the door open, the room was a confined space of terror. The stroller was leaning against the wall, and there were signs of a struggle on the floor. At first, Sarah tried to resist, as evidenced by scratches on her arms. Then she became completely immobile. She died of strangulation. John had shot himself with a pistol found on the nightstand. There was a note left on the table. "Now we are free. No walls come between us." Investigators later concluded that the murder was not premeditated. It was the culmination of years of pressure, isolation, and the loss of boundaries between addiction and obsession. Psychiatrists who analyzed John's behavior noted that he didn't perceive his daughter as a separate person. He saw her as an extension of himself, the only proof of his own existence. When she began to show signs of distance, he perceived it as a betrayal. In his mind, there was no distinction between love, power, and control. When John's body was discovered, his face was calm. Her hand lay in his lap. Everything indicated that in his final moments, he hadn't realized what he'd done. He believed he'd freed them both. When the police closed the case, the reports were left with dry lines: family isolation, psychological dependence, possessive murder. But behind these formulations lay the story of a man who gradually destroyed the boundaries between care and authority, turning them into instruments of subjugation. The house where it happened showed no signs of disorder. Everything was in its place. A photograph sat on the windowsill, Sarah smiling, her father holding her shoulder. Experts noted that the crime scene did not appear impulsive, but rather the completion of a ritual he had been building toward for years. Everything that surrounded their lives pointed to systematic pressure. Dozens of letters written by John but never sent were found in the archives. In them, he addressed unspecified forces, blaming society, doctors, and relatives, while simultaneously justifying his own behavior. In one letter he wrote, "If they hadn't taken her from me, I wouldn't have done this, but I knew they would come one day." Neighbors interviewed after the tragedy admitted to noticing signs of impending disaster. One recalled, "He looked at her not as a sick child, but as someone he couldn't breathe without." A woman living next door said that in the weeks leading up to the murder, John rarely left the house, as if waiting for the right moment. Psychologists involved in the case's analysis spoke of the phenomenon of complete emotional fusion. A caregiver, deprived of external control and support, begins to perceive the dependent person as property. Combined with isolation and depression, this leads to a loss of rational perception. For John Langston, his daughter ceased to be a separate being. She became a reflection of his fears, his pain, his only meaning. The case was officially closed 6 months later. The bodies were cremated, and the house was soon sold. The new owner said that at first, he couldn't shake the feeling of heaviness. A strange silence permeated the rooms, as if the house remembered the breathing of the people who had lived there too long. A brief comment from the investigator remained in police archives. He didn't want to kill. He wanted to stop what he couldn't control. This case became an example of how caring can turn into obsession when a person ceases to distinguish between love and power. But the official conclusions explained nothing, because the true cause of the tragedy lies not in specific actions, but in a slow, almost imperceptible process when one person begins to breathe for another and then decides when to stop breathing altogether.